Hello, Namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. 2 days, 2 disasters, more than 150 earthquakes in 24 hours and one airplane colliding with another. That's the story of Japan in 2024 so far. It's been a rough start, but as we watch the dramatic visuals, there's also a lesson. Japan survives massive earthquakes with a few scratches because it prepares for disaster. The whole world can learn from this to prepare and prevent rather than repair and repent. Tonight we'll tell you Japan's story, also the India-China story. Are they fighting a trade war? Is that even a possibility? Because it cannot be business as usual. In the Red Sea, ships of all descriptions are coming under Houthi attacks. How come the Russians are unaffected? We'll discuss that. Meanwhile, Europe has come up with a new coalition to prevent submarine sabotage. We'll tell you about the era of seabed warfare. Also, why Netanyahu is under fire from all sides in Israel. The UK House of Lords guzzled champagne worth millions of dollars in a year. Why Britain wants to bar the families of foreign students from entering the country. Why Ethiopia's Red Sea port deal with Somaliland can trigger a new conflict. What is dry January? How can a month without alcohol change your body? And why Giorgia Meloni has been named Man of the Year. We say she should reject it. All this and more coming up. The headlines first. The war spills over. Syria accuses Israel of launching airstrikes on its territory. The attack near its capital, Damascus, reportedly targeted Hezbollah militants. Israel says it won't allow Iran, which backs Hezbollah, to expand its presence in Syria. Turkey arrests 33 people, claims they were spying for Israel's intelligence agency. They're also accused of planning abductions on behalf of Mossad. Ties between Turkey and Israel have nosedived since the war in Gaza. Turkish President Erdogan is one of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's harshest critics. In India, it's day 2 of the nationwide truckers' strike. They're protesting against a new law. Under it, a driver faces up to 10 years imprisonment in a hit-and-run case. The 3-day strike has led to fears of fuel supply shortage, long queues seen at petrol pumps in many cities. South Korean opposition leader stabbed in the neck in Busan. Lee Jae-myung has been hospitalized. His injuries are not life-threatening. The motive for the attack is unclear. In 2022, Lee narrowly lost the presidential election. Thailand to extend visa-free entry for Chinese tourists. Last year, Bangkok had waived visas for Chinese citizens to boost tourism. It was under a temporary scheme which was to expire in February this year. Thailand gets the maximum number of foreign tourists from Malaysia and China. And Jenny Hermoso testifies about Luis Rubiales' World Cup kiss. Last September, the footballer had filed a lawsuit. Under Spanish law, a non-consensual kiss can be considered sexual assault. Penalty for such an offence could lead to 4 years in prison. Japan's New Year is off to a rough start. On day 1, it was struck by massive earthquakes, and it was still reeling from that when on day 2, a passenger plane burst into flames. Take a look at this. There were 379 people on board, 367 passengers and 12 crew members. They had a miraculous escape. The plane belongs to Japan Airlines. It was completely gutted. Thankfully, none of the passengers was hurt. All of them got out safely. But how did this plane catch fire? Apparently, it collided with a small Coast Guard plane. This plane, the Coast Guard plane, had 6 crew members on board. 5 of them have died. 1 has survived. He was the captain of the plane. And this plane was engaged in earthquake relief operations. Like I said, the new year began with earthquakes for Japan. Not 1 or 2, but more than 150. That's right, since yesterday, Japan has been hit by more than 150 earthquakes. You could feel and see the ground shake. The pictures are quite dramatic.
Yabai. Oh! Wow, yabai.
The damage is extensive, but it could have been far worse. Last year, Syria and Turkey suffered a devastating earthquake. The magnitude was 7.8. More than 23,000 people died. Japan's earthquake was just as severe, measuring 7.6 on the Richter scale. Homes have collapsed, roads have caved. It was so powerful that even cars on the roads were shaking.
Yeah. 本当だ。こんな車が揺れてんの初めて。
7.6 is a very powerful earthquake, and Japan was able to minimize the damage. The death toll so far is 48. There was a tsunami warning yesterday. Today it has been lifted. But search and rescue is still on, and rescue workers are facing challenges, especially in the Ishikawa prefecture. This is in North Japan, one of the worst affected areas. Roads are damaged or blocked by rubble. The quake triggered landslides. There are reports of some fire too, and all of this has slowed down the rescue work.
We have been making all efforts to gather information since yesterday evening, but the blockage of roads means it is extremely difficult to access the northern part of the Noto Peninsula.
Japan is pouring all of its resources into the rescue efforts. Thousands of army personnel, firefighters and police officers have been dispatched to the north. As of this afternoon, 120 people still needed to be rescued. They were waiting for help.
At the moment, we have confirmed there are 120 cases of people are waiting to be rescued. We also have reports on evacuation. As of 11 a.m. today, we have confirmed that there are a total of 955 evacuation centers in Ishikawa Prefecture and Niigata Prefecture. A total of 57,360 people have evacuated.
It's a race against time, and the crisis is not over yet. Japan is expecting more aftershocks. They're likely to continue through this week.
From past examples, the likelihood that similar earthquakes will occur following a large earthquake is 10 or 20%. Therefore, please be cautious of earthquakes up to Shindo 7 in areas where powerful tremors took place for up to a week following the January 1 earthquake.
Japan can make such assessments confidently because it prepares for natural disasters. Japan takes crisis management very seriously. Every year, Japan's Prime Minister takes part in a drill, the Prime Minister. This is a crisis simulation of sorts. All his ministers join this exercise. On the day of the drill, they gather at an assembly point and conduct dry runs of crisis meetings. The drills are followed by a press conference. The Prime Minister delivers an address. He updates everyone on the preparations, and this happens every year on the 1st of September. That's when Japan observes the National Disaster Preparedness Day. This date is a grim reminder, the 1st of September. It reminds them of the great Kanto earthquake of 1923, one of the deadliest quakes to hit Japan. It killed more than 100,000 people and destroyed 370,000 homes. 370,000 homes were destroyed, 1923. Since then, Japan has taken earthquakes very seriously, and for good reason. This country is particularly vulnerable to earthquakes. It sits on Earth's fault lines. It experiences some of the world's most intense quakes. In the last 10 years, Japan has suffered 20% of the world's strongest earthquakes, and it has managed to survive all of them. How did they do it? How did Japan ace disaster preparedness? By deploying a multifaceted approach. Strict building codes are a big part of it. Architects have to design disaster-proof buildings. It is mandated by the law and enforced rigorously. If there's a defect in a building, the architect can be held liable for up to 10 years. That's how tough the building regulations are. People live in a constant state of readiness. Many households keep a basic survival kit at home. It includes bottled water, dry rations, a first aid kit, torches, even a radio to receive emergency broadcasts. Japan is always prepared for an earthquake because there's always the risk of one. Tokyo in particular is among the most vulnerable. The Japanese government conducted a study recently. It found that in the next 3 decades, Tokyo could suffer a powerful earthquake, the kind that we saw this week, and it will cause extensive damage. The experts also gave an estimate. The losses will be around 95 trillion yen. That's more than 650 billion US dollars. That is the estimated loss. So Japan has no option but to stay prepared. And that can be said for a lot of countries. They sit on seismic fault lines. They are at risk of suffering major quakes, but few take disaster management as seriously as the Japanese do. So let these dramatic visuals from Japan also serve as a lesson and a reminder that by failing to prepare, you're preparing to fail. Can trade prevent wars? It was a big question of the last century. Would countries that buy from each other attack each other? The assumption was no, they won't. But today the situation has changed. If you can't wage wars, you can wage trade wars. You can hurt the economy instead. Could India and China descend to that level? Could there be a trade war between India and China? And here's why I ask. India is investigating multiple Chinese exports, like tempered glass, glass mirrors, vacuum flasks, and drawer slides. At least 32 types of products are on India's radar. And what is this investigation about? Dumping. Say glass mirrors cost $5 in China, but China is exporting them at $4. So the export price is lower than the market price, and this is called dumping. Why do countries do it? To flood and dominate foreign markets, they dump goods. I mean, who doesn't like cheaper goods? So India is on the lookout for Chinese dumping. In some cases, there has been action, like on Chinese industrial lasers. India has imposed anti-dumping duties on them. The idea is to level out the playing field to make sure that local businesses do not suffer. And has China retaliated? Well, yes and no. They are investigating 2 Indian exports, but just 2 compared to India's 32 probes. So the official reaction from China has been measured. No emotional outbursts, no endless rants or complaints. Beijing is surprisingly composed. The question is why? It could be because the allegations are true. Maybe China is, in fact, dumping goods in India. Or maybe Beijing is worried about an escalation, an eventual trade war with India. It's a risky prospect for them. Just look at the India-China trade numbers. They're stacked in China's favor. India's deficit is around $51 billion, meaning we buy more than we sell. And that difference is $51 billion. It's the same with most nations. If you look at India's top 10 trading partners, we have a deficit with 9, whether it's Russia, Iraq, South Korea, or the UAE. India buys more than it sells. It has a trade deficit. The only exception is the United States of America. So we have a $51 billion deficit with China. Obviously, this benefits the Chinese. The status quo brings them a lot of money. So ideally, Beijing would like to keep it that way. No trade war, no investigations. But what about India? Can India afford to start a trade war with China? Well, it will be painful. India-China trade is worth more than $130 billion. It includes a lot of finished goods like mobile phones, smartwatches, televisions. And their USP is the unbeatable prices. Looks like Indian consumers like it. A recent poll surveyed 7,000 Indians. 55% of them had bought a Chinese product in 2023, more than half of them. They may have issues with China, but the price is too attractive. And that's the big problem. A trade war hurts consumers more than governments. So what is the solution? Well, India has opted for a targeted approach. It includes 3 steps. One is a digital wall. More than 200 Chinese apps are banned in India. Some of them are crowd favorites like PUBG and TikTok. India has banned them. Step number 2 is limiting investments. Since 2020, India has rejected 58 Chinese FDI proposals. 14 others are on hold. Now, FDI is foreign direct investment. Normally, countries welcome such proposals, but coming from China, it's like kryptonite. And among those rejected was BYD, an electric car maker in China. BYD wanted to invest $1 billion in India. They wanted to make cars in India, but New Delhi rejected that proposal. And finally, step number 3, scrutinizing Chinese operations. Dozens of Chinese firms are being probed for irregularities. Oppo is accused of evading taxes worth $550 million. Vivo is accused of money laundering. 2 of their employees were arrested last week in India, so it's not business as usual. At the same time, it's not a trade war yet. In the long term, such a strategy will not be enough. India and China are engaged in a border standoff. There are thousands of troops on both sides, plus Beijing's attitude is quite clear. There is place for only one Asian superpower. That's what China believes. And keeping that in mind, you can't just keep buying from China. Although it's not just an India problem. Most Chinese neighbors face the same issue. Look at Japan, South Korea, Vietnam. Their largest trading partner is China. At the same time, their biggest national security threat is also China. So what is the way out? Western nations are talking about de-risking, about taking supply chains outside China, and India is part of one such project, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. Now, New Delhi is not officially de-risking from China, but the plan looks to be the same. Attract more foreign investment, build a strong industrial base, and finally replace Chinese imports with locally made ones. The problem is, this will take time. Supply chains cannot be built in months. Investments often take decades to deliver. So patience is key, unless, of course, Xi Jinping decides to change his ways. But let's face it, a decades-long, painful economic recalibration looks more likely. It tells you everything you need to know about China's attitude. In the Red Sea, things remain tense. Major shipping companies are avoiding this route, oil prices are shooting up, and governments are spooked. But there seems to be one exception: Russia. Reports say Russian tankers are not rerouting. They're still sailing the Red Sea. Most of these ships are carrying crude oil. Take a look at their route. Start off from the Black Sea, enter the Mediterranean, cross the Suez Canal, sail through the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean, and finally reach the ports of India and China. I guess the question is, how? Almost a dozen ships have been attacked in the same region. Many more have rerouted their vessels. So how is Russia immune? Well, for a number of reasons. Number one, the close ties between Russia and Iran. Iran is godfather to Yemen's Houthi rebels. So maybe Tehran told them to avoid Russian ships. Plus, there is ideological symmetry. Russia wants Israel to stop the war in Gaza. It also hosted Hamas leaders in October last year. So Houthis don't have a beef with Putin. That's reason number one. Number two is the shadow fleet. Russia doesn't use Western ships or tankers. They can't after the sanctions. Instead, Moscow uses a shadow fleet, old tankers bought mostly after 2022. They're slow, they're hard to maintain, but the upside is there is no Israeli link. The Houthis say they will only attack 2 kinds of ships, those heading to Israel and those linked to Israel. These shadow tankers do not fit the bill. Maybe that's why Russia is immune. And finally, reason number 3, maybe Russia doesn't have an option. I'll explain why I say this. The Suez Canal makes up 10% of crude oil flows, and Russia dominates this trade. In 2021, they made up 30% of southbound oil traffic. Basically, shipments from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, Russia made up 30% of this. By 2022, it was 74%. So the Red Sea is very important, a very important route for Russia. Their oil shipments to India and China take this route. Just one problem though, that trade is slowing down. India's Russian oil imports are at an 11-month low. The discounts are drying up. The payment system is complicated, so India is looking elsewhere. For example, Saudi Arabia. India's imports from Russia fell by 16 to 22%, but the imports from Saudi Arabia increased by 4%. And that's bad news for Russia, because India and China consume 90% of Russia's oil exports, so virtually all of it. If they start shifting away, Russia will lose out. So it's all about offering a great price. And you can't do that without the Suez Canal. It takes around 27 days to sail from Russia to India. If you sail around Africa, it will take 44 days, 27 to 44. That's a 63% increase in shipping time. And more time equals more cost. The same logic also applies to China. If Russian oil becomes expensive, China will look elsewhere. And the obvious candidates will be Gulf nations, the likes of Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Iraq. They have ports on the Persian Gulf, meaning these countries don't need the Red Sea to access Asia, which means Russia has no option. They need the Red Sea to maintain the price advantage. It's a risky gamble, though. Just look at what happened last month. An oil tanker was sailing from Russia to India. It was hit by 2 Houthi missiles. The tanker was called the MV Sai Baba. It was a Gabon-flagged ship. Do you see the problem here? Not every tanker can be a shadow vessel. Plus, if the Houthis get desperate, all bets are off. They're already striking at random. There is no guarantee that Russian ships will be safe. So frankly, it's not a strategic call. It seems to be a risky political and financial gamble. The question is, will it pay off? Tensions are brewing in Europe too, not because of what's happening in the Red Sea. The Europeans are worried about their pipelines being sabotaged. In October 2023, a pipeline was damaged. It's called the Baltic Connector. This is a gas pipeline, some 77 kilometers long. It runs between Finland and Estonia under the Baltic Sea. Now, gas began leaking from the pipeline. There was a sudden drop in pressure. Officials found some parts damaged. The pipeline had to be shut for repairs. And close to it, there were 2 telecom cables. They too were damaged. So Finland was concerned. Now, it's a newly minted NATO member. It got entry just last year and it suspected sabotage. So Finland kicked off an investigation. Their police suspected a Chinese cargo ship. It was near the pipeline when it started to leak. So did a Chinese ship sabotage a European pipeline? Finland believes it did. Last month, some findings were made public. How was the pipeline sabotaged? The Chinese ship used its anchor as a weapon. The ship dropped the anchor, it dragged it across the Baltic seabed, it cut the cables and gas lines along the way. It was a heavy anchor weighing some 6,000 kilos. And was this an accident? Highly unlikely. The ship dragged this massive anchor for some 180 kilometers. If the Finnish can figure this out, it's impossible that the ship's captain was unaware of what was happening. And Finland's Minister for Europe agrees. He says it's hard to believe that this was not sabotage or that it happened without Beijing's knowledge. And what's China's response? Listen to this.
With regards to the incident you have mentioned, China has maintained smooth communication with Finland and other parties. The incident is still under investigation.
Europe isn't buying China's assurances, though. They're responding with a show of force. A joint coalition has been mobilized. It is called the Joint Expeditionary Force. 10 countries are part of it, including the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, 5 Nordic countries, and 3 Baltic nations. So 10 members. Finland and Estonia are among them. And what is the job of this coalition? Protecting the undersea infrastructure. They have deployed a string of ships. In November 2023, Britain alone had dispatched 7 ships for this. 7 ships. They regularly conduct patrols and joint exercises. So Europe is ramping up its defenses because undersea pipelines and cables are strategic assets. And now they're on target. And this marks the beginning of a new era, the era of seabed warfare. So far, the world was oblivious to this. But the Nord Stream attack changed that. You may remember it. The Nord Stream attack, it happened in 2022. 2 pipelines were bombed, the Nord Stream 1 and the Nord Stream 2. They supplied gas from Russia to Germany. The pipelines were blown up by a series of underwater explosions. And who was behind it? Last year, a report pointed fingers at Ukraine, specifically at a colonel in Ukraine's special forces. Kiev denies the accusations, but the attack served as a warning for Europe. The region depends heavily on pipelines. About 27% of the world's pipelines are in Europe. They supply oil and gas. Without it, the region would freeze in winter. Internet cables are another vulnerability. 17 cables connect Europe with North America. They carry all communication and billions in financial transactions every day. What happens if these cables are cut? The entire Western economy will feel the impact. Internet will be disrupted, connectivity will suffer, and the financial repercussions will be substantial. So Europe's enemies have found a weakness, and they're looking to exploit it. It's just the second day of the new year, but problems are mounting for Benjamin Netanyahu. 2023 was the worst year, perhaps, for the Israeli Prime Minister, and by the looks of it, 2024 may not be better. Today, Israel's Supreme Court struck down the Judicial Overhaul law, a controversial law that Netanyahu raced to pass, a law that triggered the biggest protest in Israel's history. The court has struck it down. Without it, his political allies may dump him. His international allies are also wary of him. They want the war to end. Meanwhile, survivors of the Supernova music festival are suing Israeli forces. They accuse them of negligence. And the citizens of his country want him out. An opinion poll says that if elections were held today, Netanyahu's Likud party would get only 16 seats. Usually, wartime leaders are popular, but not Prime Minister Netanyahu. Our next report tells you why.
Ladies and gentlemen, to our region, to the
Last
entire
year,
world,
Benjamin Netanyahu was riding a high at the 78th UNGA meet.
here's Israel,
He came armed with a map,
of peace and prosperity.
talked about the birth of a new West Asia.
Through the
He
UAE,
boasted about peace,
Saudi Arabia,
about relations with the Arab world.
Europe.
But 2 weeks later, his new West Asia plans went up in flames. On October 7th, Hamas attacked Israel. And 88 days later, Netanyahu's troubles only keep mounting. If a wall wasn't set back enough, today the Israeli Prime Minister was handed another one, this time a legal setback. His Judicial Overhaul law was struck down. It was already highly disputed. The law was part of a judicial overhaul proposed by Netanyahu and his government. It was about greater control of courts. It was met with widespread protests. Thousands protested against it every day for months. But Netanyahu's government passed it anyway. But now the Supreme Court has rejected it, calling it a threat to Israel's democracy. So that's strike number one. But it wasn't the only one today. 42 survivors of the Nova massacre have sued the defense establishment. On October 7th, they were at an open-air music festival. It was happening in the Negev desert, just 5 kilometers away from the Israel-Gaza border. The music festival was one of Hamas's first targets. These survivors say it should have never been allowed. They argue that if there was intel about a potential attack, permission should have never been given, especially that close to the Gaza border. So they are suing everyone, from the Israeli Defense Forces to the police. They want $56 million in damages. Now, for a prime minister who's made a career out of being a security hawk, being sued for intelligence failure doesn't sound great. But Netanyahu's problems don't end there. We may have entered a new year, but it's the same old war in Gaza. Nearly 22,000 people have died in the Strip. 70% of Gaza's homes are destroyed. Netanyahu says he won't stop until Hamas is wiped out. But his allies have a bigger question. What happens after Hamas is destroyed? What is the end game? Who will govern Gaza? So far, Netanyahu has evaded these questions. Support for Israel's war in Gaza is waning, especially on the international front. Support for Netanyahu is also dwindling, especially at home. Wartime leaders are usually quite popular. Take George W. Bush, for example. During 9/11, his approval rating was at 90%. But Netanyahu is seeing so much bump. In fact, he's only losing support. A recent opinion poll suggests that if the elections were held today, Netanyahu's Likud would only get 16 seats. Currently, the party holds 32 seats. Plus, there are calls for him to resign. 70% of Israelis want him out, and the opposition agrees. He may be leading the wartime cabinet, but leaders think Israel would do better if Netanyahu sat out. Netanyahu is Israel's longest-serving leader. This is his 6th term as Prime Minister. He's always had the knack of making political comebacks, of surviving what others could not. Many call him a cat with 9 lives. But has Netanyahu now exhausted all of them?
Some words have no place in the 21st century, like slave owner or House of Lords. Not if you live in Britain, though. There you will find both these things. A House of Parliament filled with lords and inside descendants of slave owners. Have you wondered what these lords do? Well, the UK government has an interesting answer. This is what their website says, and I'm quoting. The House of Lords plays a crucial role in examining bills, questioning government action, and investigating public policy. They left out one thing: guzzling insane amounts of champagne. That's right, the House of Lords bought 1,589 bottles in 2023. 1,589 bottles in a year. Guess how much it cost? Around £90,000, which is around 113,000 US dollars. Now that's a lot of champagne, especially when sold at a so-called House of Parliament. Some political parties are livid, like the SNP or the Scottish National Party. Listen to their reaction. I'm quoting again. A parliament where unelected lords glug fizz and collect £342 a day just for showing up is not a parliament fit to properly represent the people. I must say we agree. Let's look at some basic facts about the House of Lords. It is the upper chamber of the British Parliament. Its history dates back to the 11th century. Different time, different system. Kings would often consult religious leaders and ministers on big decisions. That's how this house emerged. In later centuries, things got more refined. But the concept? It hasn't changed at all. The House of Lords has 3 types of members. The first is religious. We're talking about archbishops and bishops. Not strange at all for a secular country. Then we have 92 hereditary peers, like dukes and barons. These 92 peers can pass on their seat to an heir, almost like a club membership, except here it's in Parliament. The third type is life peers. They're also lords and ladies, just one difference though, they cannot pass on their seats after death. Put together, this house has 800 members. Let that sink in. 800 members in an unelected parliament. Even the House of Commons is smaller. They have just 650 members. So the question is, why does Britain stick with it? I guess tradition. That's the only answer that makes sense. Because as a parliament, the House of Lords is pointless. It does not represent Britain. The 10 richest peers are worth £9 billion. And let's not get started with minority and religious representation. It's basically non-existent. So these lords cannot understand the issues of today. The champagne is a perfect example. 2023 was a very tough year for Britons. The average inflation was around 7.2%. People struggled to meet basic expenses. Even doctors had to strike for more pay. And what were the lords doing? Drowning themselves in champagne. Is this what questioning government action looks like? I don't think so. Now, I know a lot of people will defend the Lords. They will say it's just nominal, that the House of Lords doesn't have any real power, which is true. The Lords cannot reject government bills. Even if they do, the Commons always prevails. So I guess the question again is, what is the point? It doesn't represent people. It is really expensive to maintain and run, and it doesn't have any real power. So what is the point? It's like that really old car you have. It always needs some kind of repair. At the same time, you won't sell it because it has sentimental value. Too many good memories. Except here, there are no good memories. It's just old white men passing on their so-called birthright to younger white men. It is not democracy in action. It's unchecked privilege in motion. From champagne-sipping lords, let's turn our attention to students. Foreign students going to the UK have been dealt a blow. Most are no longer allowed to bring over dependents. If a foreign student is married, they cannot get a visa for their spouse. If they have a child, it will have to be left behind while they study. Families will be torn asunder. People will have to choose between education and their loved ones. And the British government sees this as a victory. It's part of their plan to reduce migration. But is there any merit to the idea? Or is this just a cruel move by the Conservative Party? Our next report has the details.
British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was in a celebratory mood yesterday. He felt like boasting about a new scheme. A scheme designed to cut immigration to the UK. This is what he posted on social media. He was talking about new immigration rules that went into effect yesterday. Now, a foreign student can no longer get a visa for their dependent family members. Who does this target? Foreigners who are married or have kids, but who want to study in the UK. The students themselves enter the UK after getting through a college's admission process. Then they used to apply for a visa to bring their dependents. But under the new rules, they won't be able to do so. The British Home Minister, James Cleverly, said that students bringing over their dependents was an unreasonable practice. The Immigration Minister said it was contributing to unsustainable levels of migration. The UK Home Office called the new immigration rules tough but fair. Let's first look at the numbers. There were about 639,000 student visas issued between October 2022 and September 2023. Of these, about 153,000 weren't for the students. They were for their partners or children. That's almost 24%. The numbers have spiked over the past few years. In 2019, the proportion of dependents used to be about 5%. This is why the UK government says bringing dependents is not sustainable. The numbers support their argument. However, let's look at the other side. The UK government has been encouraging students to come to the country. In 2019, it had issued 269,000 student visas. Now it's about double. Why would anyone want foreign students? Because they pay more, much more. Foreign students effectively subsidize education for locals. Their paying more means locals pay less. A foreign student's dependents may not pay for college, but they pay the government for their visas. So, foreign students and their families contribute to the economy. If the students eventually get jobs, they add skilled talent to a country's labour pool. So if this is the case, why is the UK targeting foreign students? The simple answer is the numbers. Migration to the UK has been going up for years, both legal and illegal. Sunak's Conservative Party prides itself on being anti-immigrant. It's a sales pitch for Tory voters. However, the numbers look bad. In 2022, net immigration was at 745,000. That's the highest it has ever been. And it makes the Tories look bad. So, reducing a large chunk of migrants was a priority, by any means necessary. The dependents of foreign students were just an easy target. It's a political gimmick. But it can lead to real problems. If foreign students stop going to the UK, colleges will suffer. They will get more expensive, and locals will have to foot the bill. Sunak's new immigration policy is a short-term plan, something to throw at his voter base before the next election. But it may backfire, because foreign students now might look at other countries, ones that aren't keen on tearing apart families for political gain.
Now let's turn our attention to Africa, to Ethiopia and its Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. The Nobel Peace Laureate is causing tensions again. He's just signed a deal with Somaliland, a memorandum of understanding with Somaliland. And what is Somaliland? A self-governed territory in the Horn of Africa. It's not a separate country. It is internationally recognized as part of Somalia. It's a delicate status quo. But yesterday, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed tore it apart. He agreed to recognize this breakaway state in exchange for a long-held desire, access to a Red Sea port. That's what Ethiopia is getting in return, the port of Berbera.
We are very happy and we thank the Ethiopian Prime Minister as we signed the agreement here. We allow them 20 kilometers of our sea and they will also recognize us as an independent state. They will become the first state to recognize Somaliland after the signing of this MOU.
It's an opportunistic move. Ethiopia has long wanted access to the Red Sea. Their Prime Minister recently called it an existential question. As in, access to the Red Sea was an existential question for Ethiopia, one that may eventually lead to war. That's what he said. He was criticized for this, for inflaming regional tensions. And yesterday he made a passing reference to this inflammatory rhetoric.
This will be the starting point of our cooperation with the brotherly people of Somaliland to grow and develop together in cooperation and to ensure our common security. As we have repeatedly stated previously, we do not wish to use force on anyone. Rather, we will use what we have cooperatively. This is the good news we bring to all of the people of Ethiopia, Somaliland, and all the peace and development-loving people on this first day of the new year.
Now, you may think this is an improvement, a move away from war, but let's look at the bigger picture. Somaliland is disputed territory. It declared independence from Somalia back in 1991, some 33 years ago. But no country has recognized it yet, not a single country, and neither has the United Nations. This is because both Somalia and Somaliland are home to the same people. They also share similar religious compositions, and they are adjacent territories. History and political differences have led to the situation between them, which is why the world refuses to recognize Somaliland's independence. It is part of Somalia for the whole world. But now Abiy Ahmed has broken with this tradition. He has put his own desire above common sense. And this could throw the Horn of Africa into chaos. I'll give you a similar example for context. Pakistan has occupied a part of India, the Indian region of Kashmir. Islamabad's troops have been squatting in this region for years. It has been a decades-old fight between India and Pakistan. But then China decided to poke its nose into this affair. It started building infrastructure in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. So, of course, India will have grievances with the Chinese. In the same way, Somalia is obviously angry.
Ethiopia's step is an offensive that endangers the stability and peace of the region, which was already wobbling with problems. It's a violation and an open invasion of Somalia's sovereignty, freedom, and the unity of the Federal Republic of Somalia. The so-called Memorandum of Understanding and Agreement of Cooperation is null and void.
Somalia has recalled its ambassador to Ethiopia. It has vowed to defend its territory by, quote-unquote, any legal means. So Abiy Ahmed's port deal is problematic. It may lead to a conflict between the two African nations, and Somaliland could get involved too, leading to further chaos in the Horn of Africa. And this is Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's latest contribution. He's been the Prime Minister of Ethiopia since 2018, and in this period he has overseen 3 major civil conflicts. He has also caused Ethiopia's relationships with its neighbors to sour, and despite this, he remains a Nobel Peace Laureate. His latest move may lead to a new war in one of the most vulnerable regions in the world. I've said this before and I'll say it again. Abiy Ahmed's Nobel Peace Prize is a farce. It should be rescinded and his actions must be condemned. For our next story, let me ask you a question. What comes to mind when you think holiday season? Family, gatherings, parties, and what's the one thing that is usually constant in all of that? For a lot of people, it's alcohol. Holiday season and alcohol are best buddies, but the hangover is terrible, especially on the first day of the new year. That's where dry January comes in. What does it mean? It's about quitting alcohol for a whole month, the first month of the year. It started as a public health campaign. Now it's a fun trend. But why is dry January so popular, and what happens to your body when you quit alcohol for a whole month? Our next report tells you.
New Year, new me. Now, how many times have we heard that? We all make New Year's resolutions like going to the gym, saving money, ditching doom scrolling, and quitting alcohol. And the last one's turned into quite a trend. It's called Dry January. You swear off alcohol for a month. That's for the month of January. One bids farewell to clinking glasses and spirited toasts. The trend is not new. It was actually started in 2013 by a British woman. Her name is Emily Robinson. She signed up for a half marathon in February. So she thought, why not stay away from alcohol in January? When she told her friends, they were fascinated. So Robinson explored the idea more. She decided to take a job in a charity. It was called Alcohol Change UK. And that's where this trend really boomed. It turned into a public health campaign, and 10 years later, it's now a fun and trendy challenge. More and more people are embracing it every year. In 2013, 4,000 people signed up for the challenge in the UK. In 2024, 8.5 million people have signed up. Americans too are welcoming it. 39% think moderate drinking is unhealthy, an 11% rise since 2018. Even the French are on board. 60% of French citizens want to try it in 2024, and that's left the French government in hot water. Dry January is the center of a political row. Health experts want the government to support it, but the French state isn't on board, and Emmanuel Macron is the most pro-alcohol French president since World War II. Apparently, according to him, a meal without wine is sad. In reality, it's anything but sad for your body. Alcohol consumption has all sorts of side effects, and long-time consumption can be bad for your liver, for your kidneys, for your heart. Alcohol abuse is one of the leading causes of mortality, and no level of it is safe. The WHO says so itself. So all those reports about a glass of wine making you better stop believing them. But while alcohol depresses the entire central nervous system during the holidays, it's a reason for cheer. Expectedly, that's when alcohol sales spike. Take India, for example. In Kerala, liquor worth 154 crores was sold in just 3 days around Christmas. New Delhi sold 46 million liquor bottles just in December. So there's the festive high, but there's also a crashing low the next day. So does Dry January make you feel better? A lot of people swear by it. And yes, there are some positives, like weight loss, better sleep, increased energy, and lower blood sugar. The hangover becomes a distant memory. But drinking is like any other addiction. The more you do it, the harder it is to stay away from it. Plus, going cold turkey isn't always a great idea. Because here's a sobering thought. Many may treat it as a reason to binge drink for the rest of the year. So think before you get on board the Dry January train.
Picture a leader. Let me ask you this. Was it a woman? There's a high chance it wasn't. I assume as much because research says so. In terms of gender, most people almost always think of a man when they think of a leader. And this phenomenon is so common, psychology has a name for it. It's called think manager, think man. This exists for a number of reasons, but mostly because no one lets us forget it. Here's a recent example. This is the front page of the Italian daily Libero Quotidiano. Recently, it paid a lengthy tribute to Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister. In the large portrait, she is seen wearing a blazer and a look of determination. And right above her head, the headline says, Man of the Year. This is a female Prime Minister, Italy's very first female Prime Minister. She was elected in October 2022, and the title obviously is not a slip-up. It is a problematic accolade. But why is Meloni receiving it? The paper has called her a strong leader. They say Giorgia Meloni has won the war of the sexes. She has, and I'm quoting, not only broken the glass ceiling, she dissolved it. That's what the newspaper says. In some ways, that is true. Then why not call her Woman of the Year or Person of the Year? Well, here's what the article says in its defense. In excessive diversity, we have reversed gender. In times of war, we have chosen someone who has shown she knows how to fight. Sure, Meloni may know how to fight. She has confronted 2 wars, a changing Europe, and multiple geopolitical shocks. But let me rephrase the question I asked. Why does all of this make her a man? Why can't a trailblazing leader, a fighter, be a woman? As I said, it's problematic. And many agree. The headline has drawn sharp criticism. Secretary of Italy's Democratic Party said, and I'm quoting, "Today a right-wing newspaper is explaining to us that politics and power are for men." An MP from Italy's Greens and Left Alliance called it an affirmation of male superiority. Now, Giorgia Meloni has not responded to the article yet. Tonight we are asking her to respond and to reject it. And I'll give you 4 reasons why. Why Giorgia Meloni should refuse to be celebrated as Man of the Year. For starters, fewer than a third of nations have ever had a woman leader. Right now, only 13 countries, 13 of the almost 200 countries in our world have a female leader. For 9 of those, it is the country's first female leader, a title that is dismissive of a female leader's gender, belittles centuries' worth of progress. It sets us back. It reinforces gender biases. Reason number 2, most leaders are either a man or have to represent themselves as such. And this is not news. We tend to associate leadership traits with men, features like forceful, dominant, strong, competent, even heroic. With one title, these subtle biases have been cemented. And the message remains that if a woman is a good leader, if she has won the battle of the sexes, then she must be a man. Like when former Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was called the only man in the cabinet. But this extends beyond politics, you see, and that's reason number 3, why she should reject it, why Meloni should reject it. This is the 3rd reason we're giving her. These stereotypes have a ripple effect each time they're enforced. For instance, did you know that Kim Kardashian is also a man? She's a reality star and a business tycoon. Last year, she was one of GQ's Men of the Year. It made for a popular magazine cover. It was the talk of the town. But the more eyeballs it grabbed, the more people confirmed the gender bias, which will harm generations. Which also brings me to reason number 4. More and more women are joining the workforce all over the world, but very few women are leaders. Of the 500 biggest companies in the world, only 8% have female CEOs because leadership from men is the norm, which puts women in a bind. And research proves this again. Taking charge is considered a male characteristic. So many women embody being more masculine. They're seen as more competent than feminine women. But they're also less likable, and so less likely to get promoted. For instance, before becoming the UK's first female Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher was a researcher and she was fired. And I'm quoting why she was fired: for being headstrong and dangerously self-opinionated. That was apparently her flaw. So it is expected for women to be masculine, but they're also punished for being so. And even when they achieve success, newspaper titles simply state that you have to be Man of the Year to be a powerful woman. But if you're still wondering what's wrong with that title, just ask yourself this: would a man accept being called Woman of the Year? I hope you have your answer. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. In Europe, swimmers brave the cold waters for the first dip of the new year. In Australia, flash flooding and storms hit the country's east coast, and Chinese astronauts enjoy a meal with space-grown vegetables to celebrate the first day of 2024. Finally, we're also taking you back in history. On this day in 1959, the Soviet Union launched Luna 1. It was the first spacecraft to leave the Earth's orbit. It was also the first to reach the vicinity of the moon. We're leaving you on that note. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.